So good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have you this evening to our seminars. Many of you have joined us in the past for these seminars. My name is Mkolisi Spanda. I am the president of the Zimbabwe chapter of the Society Conservation Biology. SCBB is an international society that brings together people working in conservation, academics, and policymakers, and other people that are interested in conservation from various fields. And so it's a pleasure to really be hosting this, and many of you from different interests, but all related to conservation. I'm the president, and Nobesu Tungwenya is the president-elect, and we have a team that we work together to do this and other things as a chapter. And on the slide, you can see Diane, Rebecca, team, and Marilyn, who are also part of our team. So you can get in touch with any of us, really, and we would really love to interact with you, whether by email or other means, but feel free to get in touch with us. My slides aren't moving. Okay, so just a quick update about our chapter. We're currently finalizing the strategy, and I know that we've said that in one or two meetings before, but we truly finalizing it based on a member survey that we did, asking many of you, and we really are grateful for all the input that you did give us on what we should focus on as a chapter. If you're not a member of the SCB, that's the Global Society for Conservation Biology, we really encourage you to do so. But even if you're not, but you're interested in conservation, and particularly as it relates to Zimbabwe, we want to ask you to register with us, sign up with us, so that we can share information. And when we have these meetings, we can send you emails just to let you know that we're having these talks and the various things that we do. We have a number of projects that we're trying to push forward. One is a resource library to bring resources, whether it's in scientific literature or grey literature, together, that we can share, and it be available for many others interested in conservation in Zimbabwe. So if you've got those sorts of resources, reports, and historical and maybe current research, whatever it is, please do get in touch with us, and we'll be grateful for that. We're at an advanced stage of doing a horizon scan, which will look at the issues in Zimbabwe and look at what in the next few years in the medium term and needs to be on our horizon as conservationists, policymakers, and researchers in the country. And we will be sending information around that, particularly when we get funding for that particular work. We have a website, zimscb.org, and we really encourage you to go in there. We have a blog, and our seminar series have links there. So if you would like to write a blog, please do get in touch with Tim, who is our vice president, and works to just make sure that all the blogs that are possible and interesting go into our website. So please do get in touch with him, and do send your blog. Again, do sign up. If you've got any ideas for seminars, please also feel free to just send suggestions to myself or to any of the team members, and we will include those. We have an interesting lineup that will look at various aspects of conservation in Zimbabwe, including fresh water. And now today we're talking about trees and all sorts of different topics that are relevant. And we would be happy to hear any suggestions from you. So please feel free to get in touch with us about that. Having said all that, I have incredible pleasure at this juncture to introduce to many of you someone that you may have seen either on social media or you know very well. I know that David is here and some old hands in the conservation space, Ken, and people who have been associated with the conservation movement in Zimbabwe for a very long time. So Gus doesn't need any introduction to many of you. I think I probably would say to many of us that do not know Gus that he's one of the most innovative conservationists in Zimbabwe with a history from helping to founding SAFIRE to phytotrade and to new things. I think what's been very exciting for many of us looking at Gus, even from a distance, is the fact that he's always sought to be quite innovative, genuinely seeking to make plants a source of economic empowerment and business for communities and for the economy in Zimbabwe. His reach and influence has gone beyond Zimbabwe. A couple of years ago when I was working with WWF and we're looking at how to push on these sorts of things, Gus' name kept popping up. So worldwide, he's well known for the work that he has done in that space and continues to do. So we are very delighted today, Gus, to have you. Zimbabwe is at a crossroads in terms of our economy. We've been in the doldrums for a while. And for many of us that also have been working in conservation, it's been almost an eternal struggle to try and make an economy out of the resources and really make a difference. So we are very excited this evening to have you speak to us about economic opportunities of indigenous plant species in Zimbabwe. He's passionate, so please, warning, you might catch on the plant bug and that Gus has, and the not only an explorer, but also I think typical business mind. So you might all go out and start businesses after this. So Gus, the floor is yours, and thank you so much for coming through and giving us this talk.
Great, thank you so much. I'm just putting up a presentation. I hope you guys can see that. So yeah, it's very nice to be talking to you. Not often giving talks at this time of night in my own home, which is kind of weird, but it's really nice, and I hope you guys are all wide awake and ready for this. The talk I'm going to give you is one I gave, is a bit slightly modified from one I gave late last year at the university. I'm giving it to you guys because I think it's very appropriate, and I hope you'll enjoy it. But when I gave it before, I had quite a lot more time in which to give it. And so this might be a bit of a rush. Right, now I have to figure out how. Okay, So I'm gonna start by introducing you to somebody. This is Sakai Shati, might talk more. She's from Chibue, Chimanimani area, Chipinge. She's got quite a few kids. She's a typical small-scale farmer. She grows a bit of maize, some millets and vegetables. The economics of her production are quite interesting. She's got 0.5 hectare of maize. She yields about 380 kilos, and she sells that for about $115. Her input costs, fertilizer, seed, 2 types of fertilizer and seed are $80 historically. That's going to go up, by the way, in the next season. And the land prep is $20. So she spends $100 and then she puts in about 18 days of labor over 4 months, and she gets $115 of maize back. But that's not all she does. She also harvests baobab fruit, and she collects them in her area. There's quite a lot of them. She sells about 800 kilos of fruit a year. She gets about $120 from that. And she doesn't have any input costs because there's no seed, there's no fertilizer. She doesn't have any land prep costs. And the total time it takes her to collect those 800 kilos of fruit is about 6 days over a 4-month period, which she usually combines with other things. She goes out in the morning every couple of days with a bag when she's collecting firewood, and she'll pick up any baobab fruit and stick them in the bag at the same time. So you can see the difference in the economics there between our main cash food crop, maize, and an indigenous plant. Very, very different. But of course, our agricultural and rural economic system is based on maize, not on baobab. So let's just have a look at where we are as a country in terms of using that model of agriculture as the basis for our production system. There are a number of threats to it, and climate change is obviously the most severe. I'm not going to go through it. You guys can look at these slides later if you want. I'm not going to explain them all now, but just to emphasize the point that obviously this is drought episodes of drought in the last 30 years, 40 years or whatever. And you know all of this, I don't need to explain it to you. Biodiversity loss is also threatening our agricultural system and food security, and you guys more than anyone understand that, so I don't need to explain that to you at all. Environmental degradation has become much more of a story. You know, deforestation, we used to hear it a lot in the 80s and 90s, then we didn't hear it for a while, and now deforestation has come back as a major issue. And of course, associated soil loss and land degradation. These are serious, genuine threats to our production system and our rural economy. We also have the burden of malnutrition, and this is something that I've been shocked to see getting worse and worse in the last few years. This is from ZIMVAC, the Zimbabwe Vulnerability Assessment, which is a nationwide assessment that happens every year. And this is just showing over 3 years, the number of people who were surveyed. It's a nationwide survey in rural areas, who had a poor diet, a borderline diet, and an acceptable diet. And what you can see is a clear trend that over the last 3 years, or 2018, 2019, 2020, people having an acceptable diet went down and the people having a poor diet went up. And you see that again when you, sometimes you see that again when you look at this. So these are showing how many people ate protein within the last week, and those numbers have gone down. And I could show you lots. I mean, those figures are there, they're clear. There's no doubt about it. People are eating a worse diet than pretty much than they've ever eaten before in Zimbabwe. And so agriculture is the victim. So, I mean, it's a problem. We've got declining yields because of climate change, but it's also the culprit. It's also contributing to a lot of these problems. And whichever way you look at it, what we're doing right now, it just isn't sustainable. It cannot go on like this. We are destroying our soils, we're destroying our biodiversity, we're depleting our water reserves, we're creating a horrifically unhealthy situation where we're heavily reliant on inputs, and most of those inputs are controlled by multinationals, not by our own companies. We're also killing ourselves. We're decimating our immune systems, both through poor diet and through exposure to agrochemicals. And it's not a pretty thing, but there are some positives coming out of this. There are changes. If I was giving this talk 20 years ago, I wouldn't be saying this. These buts didn't exist 20 years ago, but they do exist now. And that's something very positive. So the first one is the fact that there is a recognition at a kind of policy level that the model of agriculture that we've been pursuing in the past isn't all good. And Pfumvudza, you all know what it means and you all know the background to it. And I can't say that it's being implemented necessarily the way it was conceived, but it's something. The fact that we're talking about it and trying to promote it is a major change. We also have now a policy thrust to promote small grains, which I've been trying to get put as a kind of national policy priority for years, and finally it seems to be happening, which is very encouraging and rewarding to see. We are also seeing, which I at times in the last 30 years, I never thought I would see this in my lifetime, and I'm just thrilled that I am. We are finally seeing a growing movement towards traditional foods and going back towards traditional foods. And people, even urban consumers, are starting to recognize that actually, you know, the traditional food wasn't so bad and actually was quite healthy. But all of these positive things, it's not all good, because it's clear when you look at this here is from our national development strategy, and it's the food security and nutrition security. And you can see that one of the main objectives there is to increase maize production to 3 million tons a year. So even though there are these kind of threads of change, there's still a huge kind of momentum towards the old system. So where do indigenous plants fit into our future as a nation? Well, they are there in the agricultural system. These are, this was from 2017, the latest one I could find, Smallholder Agriculture Productivity Survey. And if you look there, there are a number of indigenous crops that are being grown by small-scale farmers and large-scale farmers. On the left there, those are the main ones, and they are all exotic. They don't originate in Zimbabwe. And then on the right, there's sorghum, the pearl millet, finger millet, cowpeas, the round nuts. Those are the ones that do actually come from our natural environment in Zimbabwe. And you can see, which is interesting, that this is trends 2018, 19, and 1920 on these different crops. And between those 2 years, of course, 1920 was a drought year, the production of most of the crops went down, but of the indigenous ones went up. I don't know if you can see my mouse here on the screen, but you can see cowpeas went up, sorghum went up, the pearl millet went up, the finger millet went up during that time. So let's look at these crops that we have chosen to make the mainstay of our agricultural production system. And then let's, of course, remember that this is a recent thing. You know, 200 years ago in Zimbabwe, none of those crops on the left existed. Maybe a little bit of maize. You might have seen a bit of maize, but the rest of them, they weren't here. So we are basing our rural production system in Zimbabwe on a crop which is suited to a different agroecological climate or agroecological zone than our own, and is therefore very prone to the episodic drought that afflicts us. It's also prone, or these crops are prone to pests and diseases. They require significant additional inputs in the form of chemicals, fertilizer, and so on. And those inputs are not controlled by us. They are controlled by other people outside of Zimbabwe. These crops, we are not terribly good at producing them for all of those reasons. And so when we try to build our production system on these plants, we are, of course, uncompetitive with people in other parts of the world. Look at this picture from, I assume, the Corn Belt in the US, but it could be Brazil, could have been Ukraine until recently. But you can see that that's completely different from the way that we are producing. And there's absolutely no chance we could ever produce competitively. It's also, these crops are also making us unhealthy. And this is the one that really gets me. It's like, not only are we killing our soils, but we're also killing ourselves. And I'm not going to go into detail in this, but you all know that, and I mean, statistically, some of you watching this are diabetic. And you all know that 50 years ago, 60, 70 years ago, when your grandparents were young, there was no diabetes in Zimbabwe. Or any of the other of these so-called lifestyle metabolic diseases, which are entirely related to diet and are based on the crops that we eat. And yeah, I mean, there is a recognition of this now in Zimbabwe. This is, that's a headline from one of our newspapers. That's from another one. I know people don't like to see these. This is from BBC, and it was a recent article. But the fact of the matter is that this diet is killing us slowly. This exotic crop-based arable production system is also having a horrifically negative impact on the climate. And I've been in so many ways, and I'm not going to go into them because I think you all understand, but one of the ones that always surprises me is just the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the production of synthetic fertilizers. That little red circle is around the figure there, 2.4%, which is that the manufacture of synthetic fertilizer is responsible for 2.4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which is an absolutely shocking statistic when you think about it. So, okay, so that's all the bad news, and you know, we don't need to dwell on that. I think everyone more or less understands the point I'm trying to make. But now let's look at these indigenous plants and what do they really mean. So we've got about 6,000 different plant species in Zimbabwe that are indigenous to Zimbabwe, that have evolved over thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of years in our climate, in our soils, in our agroecological conditions. About 20% of them have some form of commercial potential, and less than 1% of them are currently being exploited. I'm not the first person to figure this out, by the way. This has been known for a long time. And of course, historically, we did use many more of these species. Professor Michael Gelfand, who many of you, is a name I'm sure that's familiar to many of you, who did an absolutely extraordinary book published in the 1980s. If you ever get a chance to see it in a library, it's well worth looking at. They're very hard to find copies of this book. He interviewed about 200 traditional healers on the species of medicinal plant that they used and what the uses were. And he identified over 500 medicinal plant species that were in regular use from these 200 healers that he interviewed, which is an astonishing number when you think about it. This is a different book produced by a woman called Margaret Treadgold, also in the 1980s, where she was documenting plants in Zimbabwe that are traditionally eaten. And she had over 200 species of edible plants in that, and we're sure that there are more. So let's just theoretically imagine the potential contribution to rural livelihoods from these 6,000 different indigenous plant species that we have. So we got 16 million people in Zim. Most of them live in rural areas, 60%. Of the people living in rural areas, most of them are poor, and quite a lot of them are very poor. If you plot where the poorest people live in the country, it's not going to surprise any of you to find that most of them live in the driest areas. And the driest areas are the ones where there's not a lot in terms of agricultural opportunity. And in those areas, the poverty rates are over 80%. 62% of Zimbabwe is dry land. That's what most communal areas in Zimbabwe look like, and you are all very familiar with scenes like that. So in these poor dryland areas where we are trying to promote these exotic cash crops, there are a wide range of indigenous plants. One of the words that's used, by the way, that you may have heard for neglected and underutilized plants is Cinderella species, Cinderella plants, because they're like Cinderella in that they've always been there, but no one ever notices them. And of course, historically, they were the basis for everything. These plants survive droughts. They're there. If they didn't survive droughts, they wouldn't be there. But we've had droughts, every few years for hundreds, thousands of years, and these plants have survived that. And historically, they were the basis for pretty much everything that went on in rural areas, pre our current form of industrial agriculture. So why are they not today the basis of our rural production system? It's a question I've asked myself many times. So here's my observations, and I'm sure there are many more reasons than just the ones I'll share with you. But firstly, it's just at a policy level. So we've been trying to promote this kind of industrial agricultural model, and it's just completely blind to indigenous plants. And then on top of that, we actually had laws that almost make it illegal to use these traditional plants, indigenous plants, and actually sometimes even view them as a manifestation of witchcraft. This Suppression of Witchcraft Act still exists, by the way. But I mean, more practically, if you go to a pharmacy in Zimbabwe, what you will see on the shelf are, if you see any form of herbal medicine on the shelf, you will see herbal medicines that come from Europe and from North America and maybe from China, but almost none that come from Zimbabwe, because the Medicines Control Authority, which is the national body that approves herbal medicines, basically doesn't approve Zimbabwean herbal medicines, because as far as they're concerned, there's not enough science to justify it, so they don't get approved. So, I mean, that's still today, that is still the way it works. And yet, these are all the indigenous fruits that are consumed by people all the time. And if you ask any Zimbabwean, have you consumed an indigenous fruit in the last year? If they live in a rural area, I guarantee they will say yes. And even in urban areas, I guarantee most of you have eaten one of these fruit in the last year. So it's not that they're not there, and it's not that we don't see them. It's just that we don't recognize them at a policy level. And the same with the vegetables, of course. And I could go on and on. There's no need to. Okay, so then the argument is, all right, well, we know they're there and we all eat them, but there's no market for them. Well, it's true. There's a market for maize because the government supports the establishment for a very long time ago, in the 1930s, of a grain marketing board that bought all the maize. And ever since then, the grain marketing board is the one that buys the maize. So if I'm a farmer and I want to have some money at the end of the farming season, I know if I grow maize, they will pay me, maybe somehow. Not sure what currency, I'm not sure how long it's going to take them, but I will get paid. It's not the same with Majanji. or all kinds of other indigenous plant products. And it's the same with cotton, and it's the same with tobacco, and it's the same with all of these major cash crops. There's a ready market. So the fact that there is not a ready market for many of these indigenous plant products now is not really of any relevance, because there wasn't a market for maize either until they created one. And if you don't believe me, have a look at these products. So these are baobab products. Now, I've been working with baobab for a very long time. And when I started working with baobab, there was absolutely not a single product you would find anywhere in the world that had baobab in it. And these are all examples of products from Europe, from North America, from Asia. That look at that. That's chocolate, that's ice cream. Those are all kinds of confectionaries there. Those are cereal bars, oat-based cereals. Those are beverages. From alcoholic beverages to non-alcoholic beverages, pre-powdered mixes. These are all examples of products that have come onto the market in the last 10 or 15 years that use baobab because somebody said, let's go and make a market for baobab. So just to summarize where we are so far, the benefits of integrating indigenous plants into the agricultural system. As I've said many times, these plants are locally evolved and adapted. So they are meant to be in our climate, in our soils, in our environment. They are resilient to the effects of climate change. When the maize crop dies, the baobab trees don't die. They're culturally familiar. You know, one of the reasons we're poisoning ourselves with maize is because we don't know how to eat it. So one of the things that you need to do to maize to make it edible is a process called nixtamalization, which is what people in Central America do all the time. It's basically a kind of a fermentation that breaks down some of the compounds in maize that are toxic. We don't do that. So our maize, lectin is the compound that causes us so much problems. We don't do that because it's not culturally ours. And so we're killing ourselves. But baobab, we know exactly what to do with it, how to produce it, the best ways to make it taste nice, etc., etc. Most of the indigenous plants don't require much in the way of labor. They are wild harvested. There's very little barriers to entry. You don't need to have a tractor. You don't need to have money. You just need 2 arms, 2 legs. You can go and gather them. Most of these indigenous plants are traditionally produced, harvested by women. So this is a system that favors women. Many of them have different production seasons from conventional arable crops. So they are complementary and they can be harvested. So the baobab harvest takes place July, August, September. There's nothing else going on in that time of year. So it's a pretty useful. I'm talking about baobab because that's the one I've already mentioned, but let's not get fixated on it. There are many. Remember that picture of all of those tractors going in a line across a field? Well, when we harvest soya, or we grow soya in Zimbabwe, we are competing with farmers like that. But when we are harvesting our marula or our baobab or our majanji, we're not competing with them. And they can never compete with us. They're never going to grow baobab in Brazil or China or India because baobab trees take a long time to grow. So we're always going to have control of the baobab market. So as long as we're playing in the soya market, we don't have control. But in the baobab market, we do have control. They also add diversity to the food basket. I've already talked about the fact that we're eating less and less diversity and we're getting sicker and sicker as a result. They create all kinds of value-adding opportunities that we haven't even begun to explore. They also, indigenous plants inherently lend themselves to better use and management of biodiversity. This is a really important one because it doesn't make sense, and it wouldn't make sense if we were to supplant an exotic cash crop with an indigenous plant, if we were to grow it in a monocultural plantation. That's a horror. We shouldn't be doing that. But the thing is that many of these trees and plants, they occur naturally, and that's where they're most efficient in this natural woodland or natural ecosystem. And so actually, if we're depending on them for production, we are inherently managing our biodiversity in a much more sustainable way. And of course, they're particularly suited to, remember, I told you that 62% of Zimbabwe's land is dry land. So these indigenous plants are particularly suitable to producers that live in those areas, which is most of the poor people in the country. Okay, so if you followed me so far, you will have heard me say that indigenous plants offer an opportunity and that there are certain reasons why that opportunity is not currently being exploited. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell you what I think could be done in order to change that. And I'm going to give you an example of a non-Zimbabwean product first, which is rooibos tea. So there on the screen there, that's just me Googling rooibos tea products, and you can see just a whole bunch of different rooibos tea products. And you all know rooibos tea, and I'm going to bet that at least half of you have drunk rooibos tea once in the last year. Now, rooibos tea 50 years ago, it's an indigenous tea plant from the Cape, was unknown outside of South Africa. Nobody had ever heard of it. Funny name, couldn't get their tongue around it, and it was just unknown. But now it's everywhere. 20,000 tons a year of rooibos tea are produced in South Africa. There's thousands of small-scale farmers that are involved in the supply chain. More than half of it is exported. And why? What's made that happen? Well, this is what's made it happen. This is called the Rooibos Council. And the Rooibos Council is an organization that was set up by small-scale, large-scale farmers, researchers, the government, provincial governments, and a group of kind of NGOs that were also working with small-scale producers. And it was set up about 30, 35 years ago, and their job was to promote rooibos tea, and they have done an amazing job. They sponsor research, scientific research into the health benefits. They do a lot of marketing. You can see here they're trying to promote, I mean, if you're going to sell rooibos to someone who's never heard of it, you've got to convince them that they want to buy it. And the reason they want to buy it is because it's got all these health benefits. So what they've done is they've actually investigated the health benefits and then publicized them. They've also taken measures to protect rooibos so that no one else can plant it and grow it outside of South Africa, which is very clever. Geographical indications. You all know that you can't call sparkling wine champagne unless it's been grown in Champagne in France. That's called a geographical indication, and that's what they've done with rooibos. They protected it, so you can't grow rooibos tea outside of South Africa. So now I'm going to show you an example of which I've already talked about, but I'm giving this to you as an example because I've personally been involved in this from the beginning, of what's happened when you deliberately try to make an indigenous plant into a commercial product. So this is baobab. You all know it. Of course, it's been around for a very long time. We know it's been used in Africa traditionally for thousands of years. There are human remains in South Africa that are 30,000 years old with baobab seeds that were they had obviously been eating. So it's been there and we've all known it. It's talked about in literature in Europe in the 1500s when it was brought to Europe from Egypt. Of course, they don't grow, there's no baobabs in Egypt, so that had been traded up through East Africa. But it only started seriously developing as a commercial product in the late 1990s. And what really changed it was when an association, which I was running at the time, called Phytotrade Africa, decided it was going to try to deliberately promote baobab and develop it. And they chose baobab because it was, there are lots of different products. You've got the powder, which comes from the fruit pulp, which is a food ingredient. You've also got an oil, which comes from the seed, which is used, which has cosmetic potential use. It also is quite a charismatic African tree. Everyone, if tourists from out or people from outside of Africa know one African tree, they probably will know the baobab. So it seemed like it was one that might succeed relatively quickly. So there was no point in trying to sell it locally in Southern Africa because local consumers were simply not interested. The attitude of most Zimbabweans when I started working with baobab was, why would I want to eat this? Why would I want to pay money to eat this? I used to eat this for free when I was a kid herding cattle, and I don't want to eat it again now. I've grown up, I've moved on from there. So, and I still hear that all the time, by the way. It's fine, I don't blame anyone for that, but it just meant it wasn't worth trying to sell it in Zimbabwe. So we said, well, let's look at an export market. And the main problem was it wasn't legal in export markets because there are various regulations that are basically trade barriers to prevent us from just dumping foods in other markets. So we had to take it through a regulatory approval process to prove that it was safe. And that was a very long process, cost us a lot of money, over $500,000 US, took us 4 years. But we finally got there. So in 2008, we got baobab approved for sale in the European Union, which was a big deal because it was the first time a African plant product had gone through that process and had been approved. And there was a lot of publicity about it. This is just one of many, many, many news articles that came out at the time. But that wasn't enough. So just to get it approved doesn't mean anyone's going to buy it. Still had most people not knowing what baobab was or why they would need to buy it. So we needed to raise its profile. We needed to get consumers to know what it was. So this is just an extract from a PR campaign that we were running at the time. This was being run in the UK and German markets in 2010. And we were basically trying to get journalists to understand what baobab was and start writing articles about it in magazines and newspapers and all that kind of stuff. We then later created an organization to support the growth of the baobab industry. Specifically, so Phytotrade Africa as a trade association was working with many different species, but in 2018 we formed a baobab specific organization called the African Baobab Alliance, which I'm involved with. And our objectives as the African Baobab Alliance are to promote the growth of the baobab industry for the benefit of baobab harvesters across Africa. And we got 3 strands, basically: growing demand, improving the competitiveness and sustainability of the industry, and also common quality practices. One big part of the growing demand is, as you heard me talk about with the rooibos, is scientific research to try to validate the health benefits. We need people to know why they should buy it. So just to give you an idea of how big our vision is for baobab in Africa, baobab's found in 30 African countries. Our long-term impact goals are that about 1 million rural African women benefit from the sale of baobab fruit, 10 million hectares of baobab woodland are being conserved, 300 million tons of carbon are being sequestered every year in baobab woodland, and the industry is worth over $1 billion a year to Africa. Those are our long-term goals. So baobab, as you are probably aware, and you will have seen with those figures I showed you, the picture of all of those different products has kind of, I wouldn't say it's got there, I wouldn't say it's fully arrived, but it's definitely made it. We took a very systematic approach to developing baobab, and it worked. You can see this is the baobab trade in 2010 and going up to 2018, obviously very substantial growth in Europe, North America particularly, Australasia as well. That's the volumes and the value of tonnages of baobab every year since 2010. And basically what we've done as a sector support organization is to try to figure out what's stopping people from consuming baobab, and then to overcome that is whether it's rules and regulations, whether it's a lack of scientific justification, whether it's the fact that people don't know what it is, maybe the quality is poor, and basically just trying one by one to address those. And so far it's worked. So coming to the end, what do I think we should be doing for Zimbabwe in the future, given if we all agree with the fundamental premise, which I hope I've convinced you of, that indigenous plants are a strong basis for future economic growth. What do we do? What do we do next? Well, I think the first thing we need to do is to create some sort of organization to promote this, because if we've seen anything from rooibos and baobab and many other examples in the past, that's the most effective way to lead it. And many other countries have done that. In Namibia, they have an indigenous plant task team that's been going for years, which is a multi-stakeholder team that's chaired by the Ministry of Agriculture. They've got people from the private sector, they've got people from the research community, a lot of scientists, a lot of academics, and they are collectively trying to promote indigenous plants and the opportunities that they create. This is from Colombia, country that I often compare to Zimbabwe in terms of creative people and energy there. Country that's been a bit messed up by politics, but it's got huge potential, and they have long recognized the opportunities to promote sustainable development based on indigenous plants. And this is their national organization, which is the Biocomercio, which means trade in biological products. Sostenible means sustainable biotrade. I could show you many others from many other countries, but you don't need the point. You don't need to see more, I think, for the point to be made. The second one is a national policy framework. So there is no policy that supports anything to do with indigenous plants in Zimbabwe at the moment. And as I've already showed you, there are several policies that actively work against them. But that can change, and it will change. And some of you have been working on our biodiversity economy work, so you know what I'm talking about. South Africa has a bioeconomy strategy that puts indigenous plants right at the center, and they've been working on that for several years. It's driven by the Department of Environmental Affairs, and it's really big. You know, they're doing a lot of work there now for the last decade. Namibia is also doing it. They're starting serious work on their bioeconomy. In fact, all the countries on this map in green are countries that have national bioeconomy strategies. And as you can see, there are several in Africa and all across the world. So we don't have one, but the biodiversity economy discussions are underway in Zimbabwe, and I am optimistic. I believe that we will get there. The next step is proactively marketing. So we've got to actually push them. We can't just let them. You know, if we start going and producing and harvesting, I mean, this happens all the time. People see videos when I'm talking about a particular plant, and 6 months later, I get a phone call from some farmer in Bikita saying, I've got 500 kilos of such and such a fruit, can you help me sell it? And I'm like, sorry, dude, I can't. You know, at the moment, there aren't enough consumers in Zimbabwe that are willing to pay money for those products. And that's what we have to change, but it can be done. So I think one opportunity for us is to rebrand traditional foods, because I think traditional foods carries a lot of baggage. And I think the more contemporary term is heritage foods, something that we're proud of, something that's in our past, but that we can look at with pride. Many countries have done that. This is an example from Senegal. So Senegal has had a very proactive drive over the last few years to try to refresh and reinvigorate indigenous or traditional foods. And I mean, they make a big deal of it. All the chefs there, that's what they do. I mean, in Zimbabwe, if you go into a restaurant, it's almost, you'll very rarely find an indigenous plant being served as a food. But in Senegal, there's no way you could avoid it. They're absolutely all over it. And I could give you so many examples. This is a product which those of you who've ever heard me speak before will have heard me talk about this, and those of you that have never heard me talk about it are about to. This is Africa's #1 skincare product. It's called Vaseline. It is petroleum jelly. It's made from paraffin. Paraffin, the same paraffin that we put in our heaters and lights. Paraffin is known to cause cancer when it is in contact with the skin. And we put it on ourselves and we put it on our children. We even put it on our babies. It is a horrific product. And it should not be allowed, to be honest. But there are hundreds of indigenous plants in Zimbabwe whose seeds contain natural oil that could be used as a substitute for this. We could be making Vaseline from baobab oil, marula oil, mongongo oil, zimino oil. There are so many. Wild melon, just simple melon seed oil. You could make that. This paraffin doesn't come from Zimbabwe. It comes from somewhere else. So we import it. It's toxic. It's poisonous. And we make it into a gel and we put it onto our skin. And yet there are so many indigenous plants we could be using. These are some examples of, that's baobab oil. There you go, on the left. There you see the wild melon. That's the Kalahari melon or the Tsama melon, Amajodo. Just an example of a nice product that's available on the local market now. This is Rooibos and Resurrection Tea. Resurrection Mufandichimuka. I'm sure many of you know what I'm talking about. A wonderful product. It's traditionally used as a herbal tea. And there are so many different herbal tea products that we've got in Zimbabwe. Zumbani has had a bit of a kind of boost from the whole COVID experience. But I don't know how many of you have ever tasted Makoni tea. It's absolutely delicious. And there are at least half a dozen other traditional indigenous teas from Zimbabwe that are really good, which could easily be promoted to the same degree that Rooibos tea has been promoted. This is one of my own products, which I'm very proud of. This is a beer that we brew in Victoria Falls. It's one of my businesses. And we use Mufandichimuka. It's got a very strong flavor of it as well. So the next step is intensifying research into the commercial properties of these plants. This is a process called economic botany. If you look back to the early 1900s in Zimbabwe, we did a lot of it, but recently we have not done much of it. Other countries in the world that give this high priority. This is the NBRI, National Botanical Research Institute in Namibia. And they have a huge team working on developing commercial opportunities from indigenous plants. SANBI, South African National Biodiversity Institute in South Africa, a bit more conservation oriented, but they're also doing quite some work there. This is the Society for Economic Botany. So I'm not a member of the Society for Conservation Biology, but I am a member of the Society for Economic Botany, which is a US based. But look at this on the left. These are the countries where they have their own chapters. So there's one in Botswana, there's one in Kenya, and there's one in South Africa, but there's nothing in Zimbabwe yet. This is just one example of a research institute in Southern Africa. This is in Maun, the Okavango Research Institute, that has a program specifically looking at commercial opportunities from indigenous plants. There are so many research opportunities around this, and it's fantastic work. I mean, it's really enjoyable. The fifth thing that we can do as Zimbabwe is to take a systematic approach towards unlocking the regulatory barriers, particularly the domestic ones. So I already mentioned the Medicines Control Authority, but also the Standards Association, which is very reluctant to kind of set standards for a product that they've never come across before. We also need to unlock our ABS regulations, Nagoya Protocol, because it's a huge opportunity for us. I am about to get a new Zimbabwean product authorized for sale in the EU, which is actually the Nemo bean, round nut. I've been working on that for quite some time, and I'm very excited because I think it's got huge potential. But we should be doing that as a country. I've been doing it not as a country. As Zimbabwe, we should be looking at Zumbani. What would we need to do to get Zumbani onto the European market? What would we need to do to get Makoni tea onto the European market? And so on and so on. China, baobab. I still can't sell baobab in China because it's not legal in China, because it costs $160,000 to get the Chinese authorities to approve it. And I don't have $160,000. But $160,000 in the grand scheme of things is not a lot of money when you think how big a market China is. And sixthly, we need to be providing support to businesses that are in this area. South Africa has a pavilion at South African government finances, their equivalent to Zimtrade, has a pavilion for companies that produce natural products in various different trade shows around the world. And that's what we need to be doing as well. This is the Peruvian one at a food show that I was at a couple of years ago. This was the Peruvian national booth, all about indigenous plant products from Peru. We also need to be thinking about money and investing in businesses that are based around this. This is a fund in South America called the Eco Enterprises Fund, and that's quite a lot of money that's been putting in there into small-scale businesses around indigenous plants. So, my conclusions. I hope I've convinced you all that indigenous plants have a big role to play in the future in Zimbabwe. I hope I've also shown you that this is not something that's just going to happen by itself. It does need to be proactively promoted. I think the time is right. I think there's never been a better time for it, both globally and locally. I think consumers are aware of this. I think we as a country are coming face to face with the real impact of climate change, and we're seeing that we need to fundamentally reform our rural production system. So I think now is the time. And I think really it's up to us. I don't think we can't let anyone else do this for us. We are the ones that have to do this. And we have just got to change our mindset away from this industrial agricultural production model that was never really appropriate for Zimbabwe, but is absolutely not appropriate now. And instead think of much more creatively and looking to biodiversity. So those of you that are working on the National Biodiversity Economy strategy and work, you guys are absolutely right where it needs to be. So that's it. Thanks a lot for listening. It's very weird talking to a computer at this time of night, but I hope you guys were all there and listening and enjoying, and yeah, happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Gus. That was a lot of content, very, very, very insightful, encouraging, and yes, I think they are definitely some questions. Just want to encourage you, if you can, do raise your hand and we'll take some questions. Also feel free to put your questions on the chat box, and we will read out those questions for Gus. But let me start with one, Gus. From your experience, you've been working on the value chains for a lot of these products, particularly the baobab one, which has become very popular. And one of the challenges really, maybe you could talk from your experience, how you've managed to maintain a consistent, focused effort in just making sure that it gets to where it is at the moment, and what you've learned in doing that.
Thanks. That's a bit of a tricky question, because I must say, I mean, I have been working on it for a long time and I have had to give it consistent effort, but that's been really hard for me because I have a very wide range of interests, and I naturally like to be doing lots of different things and not doing the same thing over and over again. But what needed to happen with baobab was to do the same thing, because we had to keep pushing and keep pushing, and the only reason I was able to do it was because I just knew that it was proof of concept. Once we've done what we have done with baobab, and we have shown quite clearly that if you really push, you can make big things happen. And I think that now that has been proved, I hope other people will step in and take up other opportunities, and that is happening. I mean, we've had new marula factory opening in Zimbabwe, and there's way more people talking about indigenous plant opportunities. So I think it is happening, but I must also warn anyone, particularly in the business side, that it's hard work. And if you are looking at going into this from a commercial point of view, you need to be prepared to be in it for the long haul.
Grace, thank you very much, Gus, for that. Grace, you've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity to ask the question. Yeah, firstly, I would like to ask, there's been so much development, especially on the marketing side, from everything that you have narrated in this presentation. But I was just wondering how much effort has been put in research and development, particularly on the technology for processing both non-timber forest products as well as the underutilized species. Because, for example, to process marula is really something else. It's really difficult. Then my second question is on, you also mentioned that there have been so much development, particularly on networking side. I would cite the Baobab Alliance that you mentioned. But I was just wondering, on the lower level, have you also tried to engage the other actors? Because in Zimbabwe, if you would want to buy these products, you can go to the shops, but you can also go to Mbare Msika, you can find those things. But when you get to Mbare Msika to buy those things that are wrapped in old newspapers or used plastic bags and stuff, which is kind of reducing demand to some extent. If you go to the shops, the prices themselves are quite high. For example, if you want to buy a baobab fruit pulp. So I was just wondering, has there been an effort to organize also on the lower level so that these other disincentives, these other things that make it unappealing to buy the products can be also reduced? Thank you.
Thank you. Those are two great questions. So on the first one, processing technology, I would say no, there has not been the investment in developing the processing technology that there should be. but there's no real reason for that other than that it simply hasn't attracted the attention of the people that are, you know, that the right kind of brains and maybe the right financial resources. And that's no surprise because of the policy blindness that I referred to earlier. So look at tobacco, look at the tobacco industry. We all know how significant the tobacco industry is to us, Zimbabwe. But did you know that there is a tobacco research board here, which has been existing for 60 years, which has been the recipient of significant grant funding year after year after year, and which that's all they do is research technologies around cultivation and processing of tobacco for 60 years. And of course, as a result of that, we know a lot about tobacco. But imagine if you had spent that much time and that much energy in developing marula processing technology. Of course, we'd have the most top-ranked marula processing technologies in the world if we'd spent that kind of money on it. So it's nothing. There's nothing impossible. It can easily be done. It just hasn't been, but it needs to be, and I'm confident it will be done. But so far, unfortunately, it just hasn't attracted that kind of attention. But if we start bringing in some of our brains, because we've got plenty of brains in Zimbabwe and a few financial resources into it, we should be able to overcome those problems very quickly and easily. This is just a technical challenge. In terms of the presentation in the market, yes, that of course is a big concern. As you say, it is a negative incentive to consumers to buy these products. And again, the costs are high when you go to the supermarket of these products, because the companies that are producing them are having to overcome all these challenges. So, for example, when I started processing baobab, I had to make my own baobab processing machine. And because I can't go and buy one, that they don't exist. And it costs tens of thousands of dollars. And we made, I think the first 4 machines that we made didn't work. Because I'm not an engineer that designs machines. I'm just me. So I spent a lot of money, and of course I now have to recover the cost of all of that in the value of the product. So that makes it much more expensive. So we don't have any subsidies in this sector, but if we did have subsidies, we would be able to overcome all of those challenges.
Excellent. A couple of questions on the chat, Gus. The first one from Marco. His question is, in your experience, what is the role of indigenous people to maintain the multiple uses and benefits of plants? So that's one. And the second one from Joanne. Won't promoting the use of indigenous plants, particularly for economic growth, drive them to extinction, overutilization, particularly for the slower growing trees? And I think you might want to reflect here on the baobab experience because of its growth curve as well, which is pretty slow. And then the last one in this set is, can indigenous plants be grown on an industrial scale without causing the same land degradation as introduced species?
Great, thanks. So let me start with the first one, the role of indigenous people. Look, let's be honest, these plants would not exist if it wasn't for indigenous people having played their role in exploring their uses, conserving them, managing them. So it's obviously absolutely an essential interrelationship. What unfortunately has happened in the last few decades is that those same indigenous people that have historically looked after and nurtured and used these plants have started to kind of move away from them. And it's not too late. But what we need to do now is we need to reawaken an interest and enthusiasm in them, so that the younger generations don't lose that knowledge, because it's a tragedy. Once it's gone, it's gone. So it is essential for the future of our use of indigenous plants that we retain that cultural knowledge about them, because it would be disastrous to lose it. I could talk on this topic for a long time, but I won't. Extinction overutilization, that's a very common question. There are, of course, examples of plants where that has happened. So in Zimbabwe, we have a medicinal plant called Warburgia salutaris, which is a tree, and the bark is used by traditional healers. Unfortunately, the bark harvesting is very unsustainable and the tree dies, and it's been basically harvested to extinction. But you know, you all understand the principle of sustainable use, and you all understand that in theory, if a biological resource is given commercial value, there is a strong incentive for it to be sustainably managed. It's just a question of translating that into reality. So baobabs are an interesting one because they do grow very slowly. But this year, early this year, I did a study with a group of young researchers in the northwest of Zimbabwe, in Nwange and Binga, and we were looking at the distribution of baobabs, and we found that there were more baobabs around people's homes than there were out in the bush. And when we looked at it, we found that the reason is that people protect them around their homes and homesteads, but in the bush they don't get protected. So when in the bush, when a seedling emerges, it often gets eaten by an animal, but around people's homes it doesn't get eaten and it gets protected. So I think that simply re-emphasizes the point that if it has value, people will look after it. The main driver of loss of plant biodiversity in Zimbabwe is agricultural expansion. So land is cleared for arable production, and then those plants are gone. But if those plants become the basis for the production system, they should be conserved and looked after. So I personally think, of course, there are some plants where you're going to need to put in serious sustainability safeguards, like these ones where you're harvesting bark. But most indigenous plant products that we use are inherently sustainable. Fruit are sustainable. The tree produces them every year. They're meant to be used. That's what nature designed them for. It seeds the same thing. They're meant to be used. So I don't see that there's any real risk of that. I wouldn't like to go to the third question. I wouldn't like to see as an outcome of this conversation and other conversations that we, as I said earlier on, that we replace exotic monocultural crops with indigenous monocultural crops. That's not what I'm advocating at all. When I'm talking about indigenous plants, I'm also implying that they would be produced in a much more mixed, sustainable production system rather than a monoculture. I'm totally against monocultures for all sorts of, I hope, obvious reasons.
Excellent answers, Gus. The questions seem now to be flowing. So I'll give you a couple of them. One from Rosalind. I think this is quite interesting coming from her. How do we get Zimbabwean authorities to recognize traditional plants' value to the country's economy? And then the next one from Ken. He says the population of Zimbabwe and sub-Saharan Africa as a whole will double in the next 20 years. What do you think of the argument about land sparing, having intensive production to produce food so we can prevent expansion of agriculture into natural habitats that we see going on so fast at present in Zimbabwe? Then the last one, how do you manage to get the volumes that make some of these value chains economically viable? So some economies of scale, and how are you managing the seemingly consequent tragedy of commons as well?
Okay, great questions. I'll take it from the top. Getting Zimbabwean authorities to recognize traditional plants' value to the economy. I think that's a big one. And I'm talking to you now, trying to convince you guys of this. And I think we just have to keep going at it. I think a lot of the problem is that people have been brainwashed into believing that kind of imported crops, products, things from other parts of the world are inherently superior to our own. And that's just a mindset that we've got to lose. I mean, it's preposterous, it's ridiculous. And I think, we need people to be proud of Zimbabwean products and Zimbabwean plants. And I think, that will happen in time. I'm certain it will happen. I just think we need to try to push it and try to accelerate the time frame of the change. But I think I feel confident that we are getting there. And I believe that there will be big changes in the next few years, and people will become much more aware of the opportunities from our own plants. The idea of land sparing, I think that there is a lot of merit in that discussion. Certainly when I look at the rewilding initiatives that are going on in many kind of countries where they have had large-scale industrial agricultural production for many years, it seems to me like we don't need to get into rewilding at the moment, because we haven't done all the de-wilding. But let's just develop a production system where we don't need to go through that process, and we can build a production system in which wild, in that concept, is an integral part of the system. And for me, wild harvesting indigenous plant products is entirely consistent with a kind of mixed production system where you have maybe some bits of intensive arable production and larger bits of landscape of multiple use. Volumes to make it economically viable, that is a challenge. That really is a challenge. Some of these products are produced in significant volumes, some of them not. So as an example, marula, there's a lot of marula in Zimbabwe. Average marula tree produces about 400 or 500 kilos of fruit a year. I don't think we're going to run out of marula for a long time. Baobab, at the moment, we're only using about 15% of the baobab fruits that are available for use in Zimbabwe are actually currently being used. So there's still a long way to go there. But we've got other species, and I talk about Mfandichimuka as one example, where there are potential shortages in the future if it really became commercially viable. That's one where you would need to start cultivating it, which no one has done at the moment. But these are technical production challenges, and I mean, we're Homo sapiens. We're good at dealing with problems like that. I think we can handle it. I feel that the main challenge is to get the mindset switch to make people start looking at the opportunities. Once we start and we think that this is something that's worth investing in, I think all those technical challenges we will get through. Sorry, what was the next question? Or were those the ones I'd done?
I think the next question, I want to give Marilyn, who has her hand raised up. Marilyn, would you want to ask your question?
Thank you. Gus, this was an amazing talk. It's very close to home. I grew up around these foods, even as a city girl. My mother is an indigenous foods trader and has always been since she left high school. So it's very important for me, as somebody in conservation, to see some value adding into the line of work, because I know a lot of women in her line of work. My question to you is on I call it patenting. I don't know if it's the right word. I've always asked this question without a lot of people knowing how that goes about. How do we patent products and therefore add value, just like rooibos was, champagne was? I'm sure there's so many Swiss cheeses and so many things that are just associated. And how does value come back to our countries from protecting those products as an identity of ours? And maybe just if I can sneak this one for the sake of people like my mother, you spoke a lot on high level business, you know, exporting baobab powder. I know some people who do the same as well, and I've heard a lot of marketing strategy. That's big money. But for people in like the women, like my mother, who trade these things, the women who grow these things, is there a way of improving a local market perhaps? Or what could be the way of quickening the process for small scale players to get in on the business? Should we do value adding initiatives like meals, maybe teaching people how the foods are prepared? Or I'm just trying to think about how those small scale players can get in on the action. Thank you.
Thanks. That's great to hear it presented that way in such a personal way, talking about your own mum. I think it makes it all much more real. So the first question around the sort of intellectual property protection, this is a very topical issue, and it's one that comes up all the time. Patenting, intellectual property, access and benefit sharing. I think you have to be a bit careful about it, because it can derail you if you get too heavily into it, because it can actually hinder business rather than support it. So I think the real secret is to make this a product that everyone wants. Once you've done that, then you can start to think about how to protect us as Zimbabwean producers. I mean, the reality is rooibos is nice and easy for South Africans to protect because it only grows in South Africa. But we don't have any species in Zimbabwe, or hardly any, that only grow in Zimbabwe. If it grows in Zimbabwe, it also grows in Malawi and Mozambique and Zambia, Botswana, whatever, all these other countries. So for us, it's a little bit harder to do that. But the single biggest benefit that anyone can get from this is if there's big demand for it, because we know when there's demand, the price will go up, producers will get more, there's more opportunities, and everyone will benefit. So I would focus not so much on the intellectual property side. I would focus really on just creating and stimulating demand. That leads into your second question, which is what can small scale producers do to progress further up the value chain and just improve their kind of share of it. And I think you are absolutely right that it is value addition, and the opportunities for value addition are multiple. We haven't even begun to really explore them, but there are so many things you can do, whether it's, you know, making freezets from the fruit juice, or little herbal tinctures, or baked goods, or as I said, every mother in the country buys a pot of Vaseline once every couple of months for her kids, and that can be made. I mean, your mum can be making from one of the fruits that she is been selling, or one of the indigenous fruits, she can be making a little oil which she would be making into a Vaseline and selling it to her neighbors. There are so many opportunities. We just haven't opened our minds to them. We haven't thought about them. So we're not kind of plugged into it. But once we start to think about them, they'll come. We'll find them. There's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of opportunities.
so much, Gus. What a positive point to end the questions on, that there are lots and lots and lots of opportunities to explore in this area. So I want to say thank you so much. There was one or so questions that were still coming, but I think it means that we can continue to do this in the future. And we hope that you'll be kind enough in your busy schedule to allow us to have you again in future. I want to ask for two things before we come to a close of our talk today. First of all, if you are able, please do get on the chat, and we'll just put a poll. We want to get your answers on the best time for you to do these talks. This is the first time when we've done it in the evening. We usually do them in the late afternoon on a Thursday or Friday. We would like to hear your views on whether to do it, on what the best time might be. So Marilyn will just put a question now on the chat box. Please do go to your chat box and do answer that question. Do you prefer these talks in the evening or afternoon? Afternoon meaning late afternoon in Zimbabwe time. Then the second request I would just ask is that all of us, if you're able, as many of us are able, if we could just put on your cameras. Many of us been off camera. If you can put your camera on, we really would love to get a photo of many of you, and we know you are in different places, but it's good for us to do that. So if you may, please do put on your camera. We'll give you just 2 or 3 minutes. Wow, look who's with Ken. Yes.
Yeah, I'm in Harare actually.
You in Harare, that's wonderful to know. Yeah, yeah. So as many of us, please do put on your cameras, and we'll take a picture one moment, and we'll let you go. In your blankets, it's okay. That would make it even more interesting. Good to see you, Edson. And oh, Dave, good to see you. Brilliant. Okay, one moment. Thank you very much.
Oh, hello, hello, hello there. I had my hand up. I didn't send a chat to the presenter. I would be glad if that question can be answered before.
Thank you. Thank you, Darlington. Unfortunately, we don't have much time, so we won't be able to do that today, but please do send your question, and we will share with Gus and get back to you. Thank you, everyone. Feel free to get off as well. That would be excellent if you need to. The last announcement is just to thank you all for attending. We will be sending an announcement about when our next seminar is. Just a reminder that if you can, do sign up on our website, zimscb.org, sign up, and please be a friend or a member of our chapter. If you would like to, we so encourage you to join the Society for Conservation Biology as well. And there are links in there on where you can do that. They have made it easier for some of us in Zimbabwe and difficult places to join the society. So we would really like you to be part of that. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, and old friends. And we want to thank you, Gus, for such an insightful, stimulating talk as well. And we look forward to more interactions with you in the future. Thank you,
Thank you,
all.
guys. Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.